What Kendra are. Fordham saw in that garage would make a feared Korean Mafia boss weep like a child, and change both their lives forever. The mistake wasn't in the girl's body. It was in the metal strangling her legs, and only a mechanic's eye could see what million-dollar doctors had missed. The afternoon heat shimmered off cracked asphalt as Kendra worked alone in her small, oil-stained garage, her calloused hands buried deep in the guts of a stubborn pickup engine. The air hung thick with the familiar scent of grease, sweat, and honest work. The smell of survival in a neighborhood where people fix things because replacing them was never an option. Her reputation for brilliance with engines had spread quietly through the working-class streets. But her genius had never earned her more than enough to keep the lights on and the tools sharp. Then the silence shattered. The deep, menacing growl of an engine. Not just any engine, but one that purred with bulletproof armor and custom modifications, rolled into her bay like a threat. A massive black Mercedes G-Wagon, its windows tinted darker than midnight, its presence screaming power and danger, pulled to a stop mere feet from where she stood. Kendra straightened slowly, her wrench still in hand, her instincts screaming that her quiet world had just collided with something far beyond her pay grade. The driver's door opened with the precision of wealth, and out stepped a man who made the air itself feel colder. Jang Dong-soo. Though Kendra didn't know his name yet, wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her annual rent, his face carved from stone, his eyes radiating the kind of controlled fury that suggested he'd ended arguments with finality before. But it was the small figure emerging from the back seat that stopped Kendra's breath. A 10-year-old girl, Jang Seo-yeon, her delicate frame supported by heavy, industrial-looking leg braces that seemed to cage her legs rather than help them. Each agonizing step a visible battle against metal that should have been her ally. The vehicle overheated. Jang Dong-soo stated in a voice like gravel and ice, his English perfect but clipped. "Fix it. Ask no questions." His eyes locked onto Kendra's with an unspoken warning that felt as real as the gun she suspected was under that immaculate jacket. But Kendra's gaze had already drifted past the imposing man and his armored vehicle. Her mechanic's mind had seen something far more urgent, far more broken than any overheated engine. Those braces on the little girl's legs were torturing her with every step. The alignment was catastrophically wrong. The joints were binding instead of flexing, and the weight distribution was causing visible strain on her small body. It wasn't a medical failure. It was a mechanical disaster wrapped in expensive, imported incompetence. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it reminds us that hope and second chances are universal languages. Kendra wiped her hands on her already stained coveralls, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. "I'll check the cooling system," she said quietly, moving toward the G-Wagon's imposing hood. But even as her hands reached for the latch, her eyes betrayed her. Darting back to the little girl who stood beside her father, shifting her weight from foot to foot in a way that made Kendra's chest tighten with recognition. Jang Dong-soo's voice cut through the garage like a blade. "The vehicle. Nothing else concerns you." "Yes, sir," Kendra replied, though her mind was already racing. She'd spent 15 years diagnosing problems. In engines, in chassis, in anything that moved or should move but didn't. And what she was seeing in those leg braces was screaming at her with the same urgency as a cracked engine block or a failing brake line. She popped the hood and began her inspection, her trained hands checking hoses and connections with automatic precision. The issue was minor, a loose clamp on the coolant reservoir, probably jostled loose by the vehicle's aggressive suspension. A 5-minute fix. But those 5 minutes gave her time to watch, and what she saw made her blood run cold with professional indignation. Seo-yeon had moved closer to examine a rolling tool cart, her curiosity evident despite her obvious discomfort. Each step was a calculated effort. The girl would plant her right foot, pause as if bracing for impact, then drag her left leg forward with visible strain. The braces themselves were beautiful in a terrible way. Polished titanium with laser-etched patterns, clearly expensive, clearly custom-made. They looked like they belonged in a medical museum, not on a child who needed to walk. Kendra tightened the clamp with more force than necessary, her jaw set. She'd seen this before, not in people but in machines. When engineers prioritized aesthetics over function, when they designed for the showroom instead of the road. These braces were the equivalent of a sports car with a beautiful body and a worthless engine. All done, she announced, closing the hood with a decisive click. Jang Dong-soo reached for his wallet, but Kendra held up a hand. No charge for a clamp. But, she hesitated, knowing she was about to cross a line drawn in blood and fear. Sir, I need to ask about your daughter's braces. The temperature in the garage seemed to drop 20 degrees. Jang Dong-soo's hand froze, his entire body going rigid with a predator's stillness. You were told. I know, Kendra interrupted, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. But I'm a mechanic, and those braces are mechanically unsound. She knelt down slowly, positioning herself at Seo-yun's eye level. The girl watched her with dark, intelligent eyes that held more pain than any 10-year-old should know. May I look at your braces, sweetheart? Just look, I promise. Seo-yun glanced up at her father, who gave a barely perceptible nod, though his hand had moved inside his jacket. Kendra pretended not to notice. She examined the joints, the attachment points, the way the metal curved against the small legs. Up close, it was even worse than she'd thought. These aren't aligned with your natural gait, Kendra said softly, speaking to Seo-yun, but knowing the father was listening to every word. See here? The knee joint is positioned 3 degrees too far lateral. Every time you step, it's pulling your leg outward when it should move straight. And these lower supports, she ran her finger along the calf brace, they're creating pressure points because the metal is too rigid. It's not flexing with your muscle movement. 7 specialists. Jang Dong-soo's voice came from above, tight with barely contained emotion. 3 countries. $17 million in medical care. You think you know better? Kendra stood, meeting his gaze without flinching. Sir, those specialists treated your daughter's condition. But nobody treated the braces as an engineering problem. She gestured to her cluttered garage, to the lifts and the tools and the half-disassembled engines. This is what I do. I fix things that should work but don't. And those braces, she pointed at Seo-yun's legs, they're beautiful, they're expensive, they're built by people who understand medicine. But they don't understand stress distribution, metal fatigue, or kinematic motion. That's not medicine. That's mechanical engineering. And I can fix it. The silence that followed Kendra's words felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Jang Dong-soo took a single step forward, and despite every instinct screaming at her to back away, Kendra held her ground. His eyes had gone flat, emotionless, the look of a man who had made difficult decisions and never lost sleep over them. You have extraordinary confidence, he said, his voice dangerously soft. For someone who works in a garage that smells like failure. He gestured dismissively at her modest shop. Dr. Heinrich Volker in Munich. Dr. Yuki Tanaka in Tokyo. Professor Sarah Chin at Johns Hopkins. These are not mechanics playing with wrenches. These are the finest orthopedic specialists in the world, and you, his lip curled slightly. You think you can do better? Kendra felt the weight of his contempt, designed to crush her, to put her back in her place. But she'd spent too many years being underestimated, too many nights proving herself in a world that looked at her and saw nothing but limitations. She walked over to her workbench and grabbed a wrench, holding it up. This wrench weighs 2 pounds, she said calmly. If I hang it from a single point of weak metal, that metal will eventually crack from the stress concentration. But if I distribute that same 2 pounds across a properly designed support structure, she grabbed a metal bracket from her shelf. The stress spreads out. The metal doesn't fail. It's basic physics, sir. Force divided by area equals pressure. She moved to a rolling whiteboard covered in engine diagrams, quickly wiping it clean and sketching as she spoke. Your daughter weighs, what, 70 pounds? When she walks, every step generates impact force. Those braces are concentrating that force on 3 pressure points. Here, here, and here. She marked the spots with decisive strokes. The rigid titanium doesn't absorb shock, so every impact travels straight into her legs and spine. The misalignment means her muscles are working against the brace instead of with it. She's not just carrying her own weight, she's fighting the equipment that's supposed to help her. Jang Dong-soo's expression hadn't changed, but something flickered in his eyes. Interest, maybe. Or the beginning of doubt. I can redesign the joint mechanisms using principles I use for custom suspension systems. Kendra continued, her voice gaining strength. Flexible coupling points that move with her natural motion. Weight-bearing structures that distribute load across the entire frame. Shock-absorbing materials at the contact points. The specialists gave you medical solutions. I'm offering you mechanical optimization. And if you fail? The question came like a gunshot. If you hurt her? If these, he spat the word like poison. Mechanical optimizations cause more damage. Kendra met his stare. Then you know where I work. You know where I live. And I suspect you know exactly how to make me regret it. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. But I won't fail, sir. Because I can't afford to. And more importantly, because Kendra looked at Seo-yun, who had moved closer during the conversation, her small face turned up toward the adults discussing her fate. She deserves better than beautiful equipment that tortures her. For a long moment, nobody moved. The garage felt frozen in time, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the ticking of cooling metal from the G-Wagon. Then Seo-yun did something that changed everything. She reached up and tugged gently on her father's sleeve. When he looked down, she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her eyes held a quiet, desperate plea that transcended language, a child's faith meeting a father's fear. Kendra watched something crack in Jang Dongsu's granite facade, a hairline fracture in the armor he'd built around himself. He closed his eyes briefly, his jaw working as if chewing on words too difficult to swallow. When he opened them again, they were still hard, still dangerous, but there was something else there now. Something that looked almost like hope, and that made him even more terrifying. 3 days, he said finally, his voice rough. You have 3 days. I will be here. Every hour. Watching. He placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder with unexpected gentleness. If you give me reason to doubt you, mechanic, even for 1 second. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Kendra nodded once, accepting the terms of a bargain that might save a child's life, or end her own. The first thing Kendra did was clear her workbench, pushing aside engine parts and half-finished repairs to create a sterile workspace. The second thing she did was try to ignore the fact that Jang Dongsu had positioned himself exactly 12 feet away, seated in a metal folding chair he'd pulled from the corner, his hands resting on his knees, watching her with the unblinking intensity of a predator sizing up prey. Seo-yun sat on a padded stool nearby, her legs extended, her small hands gripping the edges as Kendra carefully removed the first brace. The girl winced as the metal separated from her skin, revealing red pressure marks that made Kendra's jaw tighten. She said nothing, just worked with gentle efficiency, her fingers steady despite the weight of Dongsu's stare burning into her back. These attachment points are digging into the tibial nerve pathway, Kendra muttered, more to herself than anyone else, examining the interior padding that had compressed into useless, hardened lumps. No wonder every step hurts. She set the first brace on the workbench and began the second removal, her movements slow and careful, treating Seo-yun's legs like the delicate machinery they were. When both braces lay before her, Kendra pulled on her magnifying visor and grabbed her toolkit. She started with the surgical precision she used on engine timing systems, removing screws, separating joint assemblies, stripping away the cosmetic plating to expose the structural framework beneath. Each piece she removed, she labeled and organized, her workspace transforming into a map of mechanical failure. The hours crawled by in suffocating silence. Dongsu never moved, never checked his phone, never looked away. His presence was like a physical weight pressing down on the garage, making the air feel thinner, harder to breathe. Kendra felt sweat trickling down her spine that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. She worked through the disassembly with methodical focus, photographing each joint, measuring angles with her digital calipers, making notes on stress points and failure modes. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the silence like a wrench dropping on concrete. The pivot mechanism here was designed for a 90-degree range of motion, she said, holding up a joint assembly to the light. But the human knee needs about 140 degrees for normal walking. They built it like a door hinge when it should work like a suspension joint. She glanced back at Dongsu. This isn't criticism of the doctors. They prescribed what they thought would work. But the engineers who built it didn't understand biomechanics. Dongsu's expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture shifted slightly, a microscopic relaxation of his shoulders that Kendra noticed only because she'd spent years reading the language of stressed metal and straining joints. She turned back to her work, using a grinding wheel to carefully reshape one of the metal struts. Sparks flew in controlled arcs, and the sharp tang of hot metal joined the garage's usual perfume of oil and rubber. Kendra worked with the same intense concentration she brought to rebuilding a racing engine. Measuring twice, cutting once, checking and rechecking every dimension. "You do this often?" Dongsu's voice came suddenly, startling her. It was the first voluntary words he'd spoken in 3 hours. Kendra looked up, pulling her safety glasses onto her forehead. "Rebuild medical equipment in my garage while being watched by someone who could kill me? First time, actually." The faintest ghost of something, not quite a smile, but perhaps its distant cousin, flickered across Dongsu's face before vanishing. "I meant precision work. Custom fabrication." "Every day," Kendra replied, returning to her grinding. "Racing suspension modifications, custom exhaust systems, engine rebuilds for clients who need their vehicles to perform beyond factory specifications. Different applications, same principles. Stress, load, motion, material science." She held up a freshly modified strut, examining it against her measurements. "Your daughter's braces needed the same thing my clients' cars need. Someone who understands that making something work isn't the same as making it work well." Dongsu fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Less suffocating, less hostile. When Kendra glanced over her shoulder minutes later, she caught him watching not her hands but his daughter, who had fallen asleep on the stool, her head tilted back against the wall, her face finally peaceful in unconsciousness. And in that unguarded moment, Kendra saw past the Mafia boss, past the expensive suit and the lethal reputation, to something else entirely. A father who had watched his child suffer, and found himself powerless despite all his money and fear and influence. She turned back to her work, her hands moving faster now, driven by something more than survival. "Listen, if you've made it this far in the story, you're invested. You want to know what happens next. But here's the thing. Most people scroll past these stories without subscribing. They watch, they enjoy, and they disappear. If this story matters to you, if you actually care how it ends, hit that subscribe button, please. It takes 2 seconds. And if you don't, you'll probably forget about this channel and never hear any other amazing stories from me." By the second day, Kendra's garage had transformed into something between a machine shop and a medical laboratory. Sheets of aerospace-grade aluminum lay across her workbench alongside the disassembled braces, while her welding station glowed with the steady blue flame of precision work. Seo-yun sat closer now, no longer on the distant stool, but perched on a rolling chair beside Kendra's workspace, her dark eyes following every movement with intense curiosity. "See this joint?" Kendra held up a newly fabricated piece, still warm from the TIG welder. "This is called a ball and socket design. Your old braces used a simple hinge, but this," she rotated the joint, showing its fluid multi-directional movement. "This moves the way your knee actually wants to move. Not just forward and back, but with a little rotation and lateral flex." Seo-yun leaned forward, her small fingers reaching out tentatively. "Can I touch it?" "Absolutely. You're the engineer on this project. You need to understand how it works." Kendra placed the joint in the girl's hands, watching as she experimented with its range of motion, her face lighting up with understanding. Dongsu remained in his chair, but over the past 30 hours, his posture had subtly changed. He still watched, still radiated danger, but his arms were no longer crossed defensively. His hands rested loosely on his knees, and occasionally, just occasionally, Kendra caught him leaning forward slightly when she explained something particularly technical. Kendra returned to her welding, pulling down her helmet and striking an arc. The aluminum required a delicate touch, too much heat and it would warp, too little and the weld would fail. She worked in short, controlled bursts, building up the joint reinforcements with layers of perfectly fused metal. When she finished and lifted her helmet, she found Seo-yun sketching something on a piece of paper. "What's that?" Kendra asked, wiping sweat from her forehead. "The pressure points," Seo-yun said quietly, her English careful but clear. She'd drawn a simple outline of her legs and marked several spots with X's. "These are where the old braces hurt the most." Kendra felt her heart constrict. That's perfect. That's exactly what I needed. She pulled her own chair closer, studying the drawing with the seriousness it deserved. Okay, so here, and here. These are all places where hard metal meets soft tissue with no cushioning. We're going to fix that. She grabbed a sheet of specialized foam material, the same kind used in high-end racing seats. This is called viscoelastic polymer. It stays soft when you're standing still, but when you put weight on it, it spreads the pressure out. Feel it. Seo-yun pressed her thumb into the foam, watching with fascination as it slowly returned to shape. It remembers? Exactly. It remembers and it adapts. Kendra began cutting the foam to size, but instead of working alone, she handed Seo-yun a marker. I need you to trace the exact shape of where the brace touches your leg. Can you do that? For the next hour, they worked as partners. Seo-yun provided the measurements, pointing out with surprising technical precision where the old braces had created problems. Kendra translated that information into design solutions, cutting and shaping the new components while explaining her reasoning at every step. Why use aluminum instead of titanium? Seo-yun asked, running her fingers over the lightweight frame taking shape on the workbench. Great question. Titanium is stronger, but it's also rigid and heavy. Aluminum has just enough flex to absorb shock, and at your weight, we don't need titanium's strength. We need smart engineering, not expensive materials. Kendra held up two pieces side by side. Feel the difference. Seo-yun tested both, nodding seriously. The aluminum feels kinder. Kendra had to pause, struck by the simple profundity of the observation. Yes, she said softly. Yes, that's exactly right. Engineering should be kind. From his chair, Dong-su cleared his throat, a small sound that somehow carried weight. When Kendra glanced over, she saw something unexpected in his expression. Not gratitude exactly, not yet, but perhaps the first recognition that she wasn't just fixing equipment. She was teaching his daughter that her pain mattered, that her input was valuable, that she wasn't broken. The world around her had simply been built wrong. Tomorrow, Kendra said, addressing them both, we assemble everything and do the fitting. Seo-yun, I'm going to need you to be honest with me about every sensation, okay? Even the small ones. You're the test pilot for this system. The girl straightened in her chair, shoulders back, chin lifted with new purpose. I can do that. I know you can, Kendra said, and she meant it. The third morning arrived with an unexpected softness. Kendra had worked through the night, fine-tuning the final adjustments, and when Seo-yun arrived with her father, the girl's eyes went immediately to the nearly completed braces laid out on a clean white cloth like surgical instruments. They gleamed under the garage lights, sleek, purposeful, and somehow hopeful. They're beautiful, Seo-yun whispered, approaching the workbench with reverence. They're functional, Kendra corrected gently, though she smiled. But I'm glad you think so. She was applying the final layer of protective coating when Seo-yun's voice came again, so quiet Kendra almost missed it. I used to want to dance. Kendra's hand stilled on the brush. She set it down carefully, giving the girl her full attention. Used to. Seo-yun traced a finger along the edge of the workbench, not meeting Kendra's eyes. Before the accident, I took ballet. I was going to audition for the youth company. Her voice carried the particular ache of dreams deferred, dreams buried so deep that speaking them aloud felt like excavating bones. But after, the doctors said dancing was impossible. They said I should focus on walking, just walking, and be grateful for that. Kendra felt something crack open in her chest. She'd heard similar words in her own life, different context but the same message. Lower your expectations, accept your limitations, be grateful for small mercies. She wiped her hands on a rag and moved to sit on the workbench edge, eye level with Seo-yun. Can I tell you something about engineering? Kendra asked. When Seo-yun nodded, she continued. The Wright brothers were told human flight was impossible. Every expert, every scientist, every person with credentials said it couldn't be done. But they didn't listen to limitations, they listened to the problem. They didn't try to make humans stronger, they made the design smarter. But I'm not an airplane, Seo-yun said, a ghost of a smile crossing her face despite the sadness. No, you're better. You're adaptable. You're intelligent. You're brave. Kendra gestured to the new braces. These won't make you a dancer overnight. I won't lie to you about that. but they'll give you the foundation: pain-free movement, proper alignment, shock absorption. What you build on that foundation, that's up to you, not to doctors who don't know your heart. Seo Yun's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. You really believe that? I believe that strength isn't about what your body can do despite its limitations, Kendra said firmly. Strength is about using your mind to overcome them. Every single tool in this garage exists because someone refused to accept that a problem was unsolvable. You've already proven you're stronger than most adults I know. You've lived with pain that would break grown men, and you're still curious, still hopeful, still dreaming. That's not weakness. That's the foundation of everything great. From his position near the garage entrance, Dongsu shifted. Kendra had learned to read his subtle movements over the past 3 days. The slight turn of his head, the way his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He was listening, truly listening, and something in that fierce, protective shell was responding to the kindness his money had never been able to buy his daughter. Miss Fordham, Seo Yun said, her voice steadier now. When these work, not if, when, will you teach me about engineering? About how you think through problems. Kendra felt her throat tighten. I would be honored. Seo Yun, Dongsu's voice cut in, not harsh but firm. Don't impose on Miss Fordham's time. It's not an imposition, Kendra interrupted, meeting his gaze directly. Sir, your daughter has a natural aptitude for mechanical thinking. These past 2 days, she's understood concepts that I've had to explain 3 times to engineering students. If she wants to learn, I want to teach. She paused, then added with careful emphasis. Dreams don't die just because someone says they're impractical. They just wait for better engineering. Something passed between them then, an understanding that transcended the threat and the fear and the impossible circumstances that had brought them together. Dongsu gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, not permission exactly, but acknowledgement. His daughter deserved more than his protection. She deserved possibility. But his hand remained close to his jacket, and his eyes never fully softened. The pressure remained, a constant reminder that Kendra's success was measured not in her effort, but in one metric alone: whether Seo Yun could walk without pain. Everything else, the trust, the connection, the fragile hope building in this garage, balanced on that single, terrifying outcome. Kendra turned back to the braces, her hands steady despite the weight of what came next. The garage fell into a cathedral silence as Kendra lifted the completed braces from the workbench. 3 days of grinding, welding, measuring, and rebuilding had culminated in this moment. 2 pieces of engineered hope that weighed less than half of what they'd replaced, but carried the full weight of everyone's expectations. The new braces bore little resemblance to their predecessors. Gone were the rigid titanium shells and ornate laser etchings, replaced by flowing lines of brushed aluminum that curved with organic grace. The joints moved with whisper-quiet precision, ball-and-socket mechanisms that rotated smoothly through their full range of motion. Custom-cut viscoelastic padding lined every contact point, and adjustable straps replaced the harsh clamp-style attachments that had left Seo Yun's skin raw and marked. They look like they belong to the future, Seo Yun breathed, her hands hovering over the metal but not quite touching, as if afraid they might disappear. They belong to you, Kendra corrected softly. She'd barely slept in 72 hours, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, but looking at the girl's face made every exhausted hour worth it. Ready to try them on? Seo Yun nodded, but Kendra caught the flicker of fear behind the excitement. The learned response of someone who'd been hurt too many times by devices meant to help. Dongsu moved forward for the first time in hours, his expensive shoes silent on the concrete floor, positioning himself where he could see his daughter's face. Kendra knelt down, the new braces cradled in her arms like precious cargo. Okay, we're going to do this slow. I want you to tell me everything you feel: pressure, temperature, comfort, discomfort. Everything. You're still the engineer here. She started with the right leg, sliding the brace into position with practiced gentleness. The custom-fitted aluminum shell aligned perfectly with Seo Yun's calf, the padding conforming to her leg's contours without binding. Kendra secured the straps, checking and rechecking the tension, her fingers dancing over the adjustment points with the same precision she used timing an engine's valve clearances. How does that feel? Kendra asked, not looking at the brace but at Seo Yun's face, reading the truth there. It's light, Seo-yun said, surprise evident in her voice. I can barely feel it. That's the idea. Medical equipment shouldn't remind you that you're wearing it every second. Kendra moved to the left leg, repeating the process with the same meticulous care. This brace slid on even more smoothly, the months of pain having taught Kendra exactly where every pressure point existed, every place where flesh and metal had waged their quiet war. She finished the final strap and sat back on her heels, her heart hammering against her ribs. Okay, all done. How do they feel? Seo-yun flexed her ankles experimentally, her eyes widening with each small movement. She bent her knees slightly, testing the joints that had once fought her at every angle. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again as if the words she needed didn't quite exist in any language she knew. Then she turned to her father, and her voice came out in a whisper that somehow filled the entire garage. Papa, they don't bite me. For words. For simple words that carried the weight of years of suffering, of nights crying into pillows, of every step that had been a negotiation with pain. Kendra watched Dong-su's face and saw the exact moment those words landed, saw his jaw tighten, his eyes close briefly as if absorbing a physical blow. They don't hurt at all? His voice was rough, stripped of its usual controlled menace. They feel like... Seo-yun searched for the words, her hands running over the smooth aluminum. Like they're part of me. Like they want to help instead of punish. She looked up at Kendra with eyes that shone with unshed tears and something that looked like wonder. Can I try to stand? Kendra's throat constricted. This was it. The moment that would either validate 3 days of obsessive work or reveal that she'd promised more than physics could deliver. She offered her hands to Seo-yun, palms up, an invitation rather than a command. Whenever you're ready, Kendra said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. We go at your pace. Always. Seo-yun placed her small hands in Kendra's calloused ones, and together, they prepared to find out if hope could be engineered after all. Listen, if you've made it this far in the story, you're invested. You want to know what happens next. But here's the thing. Most people scroll past these stories without subscribing. They watch, they enjoy, and they disappear. If this story matters to you, if you actually care how it ends, hit that subscribe button please. It takes 2 seconds. And if you don't, you'll probably forget about this channel and never hear any other amazing stories from me. Kendra held Seo-yun's hands firmly but gently, the way she might cradle a precision instrument, with respect for its fragility and faith in its potential. Remember, we're not racing. We're testing. If anything feels wrong, any pressure or pain, you tell me immediately. Okay. Seo-yun nodded, her jaw set with determination that seemed far too mature for a 10-year-old. Slowly, carefully, she shifted her weight forward, preparing to rise from the stool. Kendra watched the girl's face with laser focus, reading every micro-expression, every flicker of sensation that crossed her features. The first weight transfer came. Seo-yun's right foot pressing into the ground, the new brace bearing load for the first time. Kendra held her breath. No wince. No sharp intake of air. Just concentration as Seo-yun brought her left foot down beside it, distributing her weight evenly across both legs. How does it feel? Kendra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Different, Seo-yun said, wonder creeping into her tone. The pressure is everywhere and nowhere. Is that right? That's perfect. That means the load distribution is working. Kendra's heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. Ready to straighten up? Seo-yun pushed upward, and Kendra provided just enough support to guide, not to carry. The girl rose to her full height, standing on her own legs for the first time in years without the sensation of metal jaws clamping down with every shift of weight. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. Papa, she breathed, not looking away from her own legs as if afraid they might betray her. Papa, I'm standing and it doesn't hurt. Kendra glanced at Dong-su. He'd risen from his chair without her noticing, standing rigid a few feet away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, every muscle in his body taut as wire. His face had gone pale beneath his composure, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. Do you want to try a step? Kendra asked Seo-yun gently. Just one. We're not trying to run a marathon today. Seo-yun's grip tightened on Kendra's hands. What if? Then we adjust. That's what engineering is. We test, we learn, we improve. Kendra squeezed back reassuringly. But I don't think you're going to need adjustments. I think these braces are going to work exactly the way you deserve them to work. For a moment, nothing moved except the dust motes floating through the afternoon sunlight streaming through the garage door. Then Seo-Yun lifted her right foot. Not the dragging, compensating movement she'd done for years, but a real step, smooth and controlled. The joint flexed exactly as designed, the shock-absorbing mechanism compressing and releasing, the weight transferring through the aluminum frame into the ground without creating a single pressure spike against her skin. She placed her foot down. Solid. Stable. Pain-free. Oh, Seo-Yun whispered, and then she took another step. Her left foot rose and fell with the same miraculous ease, and Kendra felt the girl's hands trembling in hers. Not from strain or pain, but from the overwhelming sensation of movement without suffering. A sound escaped Seo-Yun's throat. Something between a laugh and a sob, a noise of pure, distilled disbelief and joy. She took a third step, then a fourth, and with each one her confidence grew. The braces moved with her like they'd been part of her body all along, silent partners in motion rather than instruments of torture. I'm walking, she said, her voice rising with wonder. I'm actually walking, Miss Fordham. The sound that interrupted her was so unexpected, so raw, that both Kendra and Seo-Yun froze mid-step. Jang Dong-soo had raised his hand to his mouth, covering it as if trying to physically hold back what was coming, but it was useless. His shoulders began to shake, small tremors at first, then full, heaving convulsions. His other hand reached out blindly, finding the edge of the workbench, gripping it so hard his knuckles went white. And then the sound came again, a broken, guttural noise that might have been a word once, but had been destroyed by emotion too vast to contain. The feared Korean Mafia boss. The man whose name made business owners pale and rivals disappear. The man who had built an empire on control and intimidation and the absolute suppression of weakness. Collapsed against the workbench as years of helplessness and rage and desperate love came pouring out of him in uncontrollable, wrenching sobs. Papa! Seo-Yun released Kendra's hands, taking 4 perfect, independent steps to her father's side. And Dong-soo, seeing his daughter walk toward him unaided for the first time since the accident, broke completely. It took several minutes before Dong-soo could speak. He stood with his arms wrapped around his daughter, his face buried in her hair, his shoulders still shaking with aftershocks of emotion that had been locked away for too long. Kendra stood back, giving them space, her own eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. This moment wasn't hers. It belonged to a father and daughter who had just been given back something everyone else took for granted. Finally, Dong-soo lifted his head. His face was ravaged, eyes red and swollen, cheeks wet with tears he made no attempt to hide. The transformation was staggering. This wasn't the cold, dangerous man who had walked into her garage 3 days ago. This was someone who had been stripped down to his most fundamental self, someone who had forgotten how to pretend. He gently released Seo-Yun, steadying her with one hand while she stood proudly on her new legs. Then he turned to Kendra, and when he spoke, his voice was thick and rough, scraped raw by emotion. Miss Fordham, he began, then stopped, his throat working as he tried to find words adequate to the moment. I came here expecting. I don't know what I expected. Failure, probably. Another disappointment in a long line of them. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture so unguarded it made him seem almost vulnerable. What you've done, what you've given my daughter, there are no words. You don't need to, Kendra started, but he held up a hand. Please, let me finish. He took a breath, composing himself with visible effort. I have spent years throwing money at this problem. The best doctors, the finest facilities, technology that costs more than most people earn in a lifetime. And none of it, not one single dollar, did what you accomplished in 3 days with scrap aluminum and foam padding. His voice cracked slightly. You gave me back my daughter's smile. You gave her hope. That is a debt that cannot be measured. He reached inside his jacket, that same gesture that had made Kendra's survival instincts scream days ago. But this time he pulled out not a weapon but a checkbook. Name your price. Any number. I will pay it without question. Or better, come work for me. Be my personal engineer. I'll build you a facility that would make MIT jealous. You'll have unlimited resources, the finest equipment, anything you need. You'll never struggle again. The offer hung in the air like smoke. Kendra knew what it meant: security, wealth, a life beyond the perpetual edge of financial disaster she'd been walking for years. She could see it clearly: a pristine laboratory, tools she'd only dreamed of, projects without the constant anxiety of unpaid bills. Or if not that, Dong-Su continued, mistaking her silence for negotiation, then anything else. A house, a new shop, money for your family, education, investments. Miss Fordham, I am not a poor man, and I do not forget debts. Especially not this one. Kendra looked at Seo Yun, who was practicing weight shifts, her face glowing with concentration and joy. She thought about her neighborhood, about the people who came to her garage because they couldn't afford the chain repair shops downtown. She thought about Mrs. Chun 2 blocks over, whose wheelchair had a bent axle that Kendra had straightened for free. About Marcus from the corner store, whose prosthetic leg kept breaking until Kendra reinforced it with materials she'd scrounged from a junkyard. Mr. Zhang, she said quietly, I appreciate the offer. I really do. But I didn't do this for money, and I can't take payment for it now. What I did for Seo Yun, that's what I want to do. Not for people who can afford to throw millions at problems, but for people who can't afford anything at all. Dong-Su stared at her as if she'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. My neighborhood is full of people with broken wheelchairs, prosthetics held together with duct tape, mobility aids that hurt more than they help, Kendra continued. They can't pay me, so I fix what I can with whatever I have. That's my dream, Mr. Zhang. To build affordable mobility devices for the forgotten people. The ones who slip through the cracks of your world and mine. She met his gaze steadily. I don't want to be rich. I want to be useful. There's a difference. For a long moment, Dong-Su said nothing. Then slowly, something like respect, maybe even understanding, dawned in his eyes. 6 months later, Kendra stood in a space she barely recognized as her own. The cramped, oil-stained garage had been transformed. Not replaced, but expanded and elevated into something that honored both what it had been and what it could become. The original bay remained, kept deliberately modest as a reminder of where miracles had been born. But beside it now stretched a bright, professional workshop with proper lighting, ventilation, and equipment that still made her breath catch every time she walked in. The sign above the door read, Fordham Community Mobility Workshop, Rehabilitation Engineering for All. What Kendra didn't know, what she would never know, was that the anonymous donation that had made all this possible had come from a man who understood that some debts could only be repaid by respecting the wishes of those you owed. Dong-Su had kept his word in the only way Kendra would accept, by making her dream real without making it about him. The Kendra R. Fordham Rehabilitation Engineering Scholarship Fund had appeared like grace from nowhere. Enough funding to establish her nonprofit, to hire 2 assistants, to purchase materials in bulk, to offer her services at cost or free to anyone who needed them. The documentation listed only anonymous donors committed to accessible mobility solutions. But Kendra sometimes wondered, in quiet moments, if she knew exactly who had set this chain of kindness in motion. She was adjusting a custom wheelchair for Mr. Patterson, a veteran whose VA-issued chair had been slowly destroying his shoulders for 2 years, when her phone chimed with a familiar notification. Kendra smiled before she even looked at the screen. Like clockwork, every Saturday at 3 p.m., the message arrived. She wiped her hands and opened the video. Seo Yun's face filled the screen, bright and animated in a way that still made Kendra's heart swell. The girl stood in what looked like a dance studio, wearing practice clothes and her braces. The ones Kendra had modified twice more as Seo Yun grew, each iteration lighter and more sophisticated than the last. Miss Fordham, look what I learned this week. Seo Yun's voice bubbled with excitement. The camera pulled back, and Kendra watched as the girl moved through a simple ballet combination. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would win competitions, but movement that was controlled, graceful, and most importantly, hers. The braces flexed and supported, visible but no longer the story. Seo Yun's determination, her joy, her hard-won strength. That was the story now. My instructor says I have excellent form, Seo Yun continued, slightly breathless as she came back to the camera. She doesn't even know about the accident unless I tell her. She just sees a dancer who works really hard. The girl's smile could have powered cities. I wanted you to know that everything you said was true. Strength is in how we solve problems, not in pretending they don't exist. The video shifted, and suddenly Dong-Soo appeared beside his daughter, his arm around her shoulders. He looked different too, still sharp, still commanding, but with a softness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Miss Fordham," he said, his tone formal but warm. "Seo-Yun insists I appear in these videos occasionally to prove I'm not, as she says, still being scary." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "We hope your work continues to flourish. Seo-Yun tells me you've helped 43 people this month. That number brings me more satisfaction than any business deal ever has." He paused, and something unspoken passed across his expression. Gratitude, respect, maybe even something like friendship, though neither of them would ever name it that. "Thank you, Miss Fordham, for everything." The video ended, and Kendra set down her phone, blinking back the moisture in her eyes. Around her, the workshop hummed with purpose. In the corner, her assistant was fitting a young man with a prosthetic leg that Kendra had designed using principles she'd learned from Seo-Yun's braces. At the other workbench, someone was rebuilding a pediatric walker, replacing expensive proprietary parts with durable, affordable alternatives. This was wealth, Kendra thought. Not the dollars that had once been offered to her, but this, the accumulation of people helped, of pain relieved, of dignity restored. Every person who walked out of her workshop with equipment that worked, that didn't hurt, that gave them back some measure of independence, they were her fortune. Mrs. Chun rolled past the open bay door in her repaired wheelchair, waving cheerfully. Marcus jogged by on his reinforced prosthetic, training for a 5K. Mr. Patterson would leave today with a chair that wouldn't destroy his body. And somewhere across the world, a little girl who had once been caged by expensive metal was dancing. Kendra picked up her wrench and returned to her work, knowing that miracles weren't bought with money or status or power. They were built carefully and lovingly, one problem at a time, by people who refused to accept that broken things had to stay broken. They were forged in modest garages by hands that understood that the strongest force in the world wasn't wealth or fear. It was compassion, paired with a good set of tools and the stubborn belief that everyone deserved to move through life without pain. That was engineering worth doing. That was a life worth living. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will experience Kendra and Seo-Yun's story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. Kindly support what I do here by subscribing. And then drop in the comment section if you would like part 2 of Kendra, Seo-Yun, and Jang Dong-Soo's story. What new challenges will come when word spreads about Kendra's miracle work? How will Dong-Soo's world react to his daughter's unlikely friendship with a mechanic? Will Kendra's workshop face threats from those who don't want affordable mobility solutions disrupting their profitable medical equipment industry? Let me know if you want to hear more.